You think black sharecroppers in the Jim Crow South survived on scraps and desperation alone? Think again. These families, trapped in cycles of debt and watched by hostile eyes, built a food culture so resourceful it turned poverty into sustenance. Let's dig into 30 forgotten foods black sharecroppers made to survive. Potlikker was the vitamin-rich broth left behind after greens simmered for hours in cast-iron pots over wood fires. Sharecropper families saved every drop, knowing it contained nutrients their bodies desperately needed after long days in cotton fields. Turnip greens, collards, or mustard greens were boiled with whatever pork scraps were available, ham hocks, fatback, or bones stripped clean from previous meals. The liquid absorbed iron, vitamins, and smoky meat essence, becoming more valuable than the greens themselves. Children drank it warm from cups while mothers soaked cornbread in it, stretching meager supplies into complete nourishment. During illness, potlikker was medicine, spooned into feverish mouths as remedy when doctors were too expensive or far away. This humble broth represented ancestral wisdom. Throwing away cooking water meant throwing away survival itself. Every family had their own way of seasoning it, making each pot unique. Ash cakes were cornmeal patties cooked directly in hot ashes of dying fires, a method passed down from enslaved ancestors. Sharecropper women mixed coarse stone ground cornmeal with water and salt, forming thick rounds wrapped in dampened cabbage leaves before being buried in warm ashes. The leaves protected cakes while allowing heat to penetrate slowly, creating crusty exteriors with dense, smoky interiors that satisfied hunger for hours. These weren't fancy breads. They were survival food made when firewood was scarce and time for proper cooking even scarcer. Field workers carried ash cakes in pockets, eating them cold during brief rest periods when walking back to the cabin wasn't possible. The taste was earthy, the texture gritty but filling, requiring nothing but meal, water, and fire already burning. Children learned this ancient technique young. Understanding it might mean the difference between hunger and sustenance. Crackling bread transformed rendered pork skin scraps into golden cornbread studded with crispy, salty morsels of flavor. When sharecropper families butchered hogs during winter months, nothing went to waste. Skin was cut into pieces and fried slowly until fat rendered out and remaining bits turned impossibly crispy. These cracklings were folded into cornmeal batter along with rendered lard and buttermilk, then baked in preheated cast iron skillets until tops turned golden brown. The bread emerged with pockets of crunchy pork throughout, each bite delivering salt, fat, and corn in perfect proportion. This wasn't everyday bread. It was celebration food made when precious cracklings were available and families gathered to share what they had preserved. The smell filled small cabins with warmth and promise, reminding everyone that even in poverty, moments of richness were possible. Children fought for corner pieces where cracklings clustered thickest. Poke salad was wild greens foraged from roadsides and fence rows by sharecropper families who knew exactly when and how to harvest this potentially dangerous plant. Pokeweed shoots were gathered young in early spring before leaves grew large and toxic, then boiled in multiple changes of water to remove bitter compounds. The process required knowledge passed through generations, which plants to pick, when to pick them, how many boilings were necessary. After draining final water, greens were fried in pork fat with onions and sometimes scrambled eggs, creating a dish tasting of spring itself. For families with no money for store-bought vegetables and limited garden space, poke salad represented free nutrition growing wild along every path. Children accompanied mothers on gathering trips, learning to identify ripe plants and understand dangers of picking too late. This tradition connected sharecroppers to land in ways transcending economic bondage. Clabber milk was raw milk left to sour naturally until it thickened into a tangy, yogurt-like substance that sharecropper families ate with cornbread or drank straight. Without refrigeration, fresh milk from the family cow wouldn't last long in southern heat, so families embraced the souring process rather than fighting it. Milk was left in crocks on cool porches until it separated into thick curds and thin whey, developing sharp flavor that modern palates might find challenging but hungry families welcomed. Some ate clabber sweetened with molasses, while others crumbled cornbread into bowls of it for breakfast or supper. The process required no special equipment, just patience and understanding that controlled spoilage differed from dangerous rot. Children often preferred it to fresh milk, having grown up with its distinctive tang as normal. Clabber provided protein and kept digestive systems healthy when medical care remained out of reach. Chitterlings were pig intestines cleaned meticulously and simmered for hours until tender, representing both the brutality and brilliance of making something from nothing. During hog killing season, sharecropper families received parts white landowners that didn't want: feet, ears, tails, and intestines requiring hours of washing to prepare. Women scraped and rinsed chitterlings multiple times, sometimes spending entire days cleaning them until ready for the pot. They simmered with onions, garlic, bay leaves, and vinegar until tough tissue became soft enough to chew, filling cabins with an aroma announcing dinner to neighbors a quarter-mile away. The taste was intense and earthy, not for timid palates, but for families who learned to embrace every edible part of the animal. Chitterlings became tradition, served at holidays as reminder of both hardship and triumph. Children understood this food carried stories of ancestors who refused to let white supremacy starve them. Sawmill gravy was thick white gravy made from pork drippings, flour, and milk, named for lumber camps where it fueled workers through brutal days of labor. Sharecropper kitchens made it from fat remaining after frying salt pork or bacon, stirring in flour until it formed a paste, then slowly adding milk while whisking constantly to prevent lumps. The gravy thickened into something creamy and savory, seasoned heavily with black pepper that left dark specks throughout. Poured over biscuits, it transformed a few cents worth of ingredients into a meal that stuck to ribs and provided energy for cotton picking. The recipe required almost nothing: drippings otherwise wiped from pans, flour from the pantry, milk from cow or can, yet delivered satisfaction beyond humble origins. Some families made it thin enough to pour, others so thick it held shape on a plate, but all recognized it as essential breakfast food. This gravy represented genius of poverty cooking. Fried fatback was thick slabs of pure pork fat cooked until crispy on edges and rendered in the middle, served alongside whatever else the table held. Sharecropper families bought fatback by the pound from country stores, often on credit, adding to mounting debts because it provided cheap calories and flavoring for nearly everything they cooked. Slices were laid in cold cast iron skillets and cooked slowly as fat melted and meat crisped, producing both a protein course and cooking grease for vegetables or cornbread. Children loved crispy edges best, fighting over pieces where fat transformed into something almost candy-like in crunch and salt. Rendered fat was saved in coffee cans, used to season greens, fry eggs, make biscuits, and coat cornbread pans. Nothing was wasted, even crispy remnants left after rendering were crumbled over food or eaten as snacks. Fatback provided dense calories that bodies working 14-hour days desperately required. Leather britches were green beans dried on strings until they became brown, wrinkled strips that could hang from kitchen rafters through entire winters. Sharecropper families grew beans in small garden plots when landlords permitted, harvesting more than they could eat fresh and preserving excess by threading them on heavy string with large needles. The bean garlands hung in warm, dry spaces near wood stoves on covered porches until moisture evaporated and they rattled like dried leaves when touched. Come winter, handfuls were soaked overnight, then simmered for hours with ham hocks or fatback until tender again, their flavor concentrated into something richer than fresh beans ever could be. This preservation required no expensive canning equipment, no sugar, no salt, just patience and string. Children helped with threading, learning food preservation as naturally as learning to walk and talk. Leather britches connected families to Appalachian traditions ancestors brought. Molasses and biscuits was the simplest breakfast or supper, yet it carried families through countless hungry mornings when nothing else filled the cupboard. Sharecroppers often received molasses as partial payment from landlords operating syrup mills, making it one of few sweeteners readily available to families who couldn't afford white sugar. Biscuits were made fresh daily from flour, lard, and buttermilk, baked in cast iron until tops turned golden and bottoms crisped from preheated pans. Biscuits were split open while still steaming, then drenched in thick, dark molasses, pooling in every crevice and soaking into tender crumb. The combination provided quick energy, carbohydrates from flour, fat from lard, sugar from molasses, fueling a morning of fieldwork. Children ate them before school, fingers sticky with syrup licked clean rather than waste. For many families, molasses and biscuits represented the baseline of survival, the meal always possible when nothing else was. Hoe cakes carried a name and legacy speaking volumes about Black survival, labor, and invention under sharecropping's brutal conditions. The term came from methods once used by enslaved field workers who placed cornmeal batter on flat hoe blades and cooked it over open flames when no kitchen was accessible. Made from cornmeal, water, salt, and sometimes bacon grease, hoe cakes were economical and filling enough to carry workers through endless hours of picking cotton. As generations moved from slavery into sharecropping, the recipe stayed but evolved. Some added buttermilk or eggs for tenderness. In rural southern kitchens, hoe cakes served alongside greens, beans, or stews used like bread to soak up juices. They were passed down without fanfare, never appearing in cookbooks, but always present on iron griddles in the morning, crisping at edges and golden in the middle. Served hot with butter, honey, or syrup, hoe cakes proved that even with barest means, Black hands could create warmth and nourishment. Sweet potato pone was a dense, pudding-like dish that transformed humble root vegetables into something resembling dessert for families who rarely tasted sugar. Sharecroppers grew sweet potatoes in garden patches because they thrived in poor soil and stored well through winter months in earthen root cellars. The potatoes were grated raw or mashed after baking, then mixed with molasses, eggs if available, spices like nutmeg or cinnamon, and sometimes a splash of buttermilk. The mixture was poured into greased cast iron pans and baked slowly until firm and caramelized on top, filling cabins with fragrance that promised something special. This wasn't everyday food. It appeared at holidays, church gatherings, or when company came, calling and families wanted to show pride despite poverty. Children scraped pans clean, savoring the sticky edges where molasses concentrated. Sweet potato pone represented how sharecroppers elevated common ingredients into celebration, refusing to let economic bondage strip away all moments of joy. Streaky was salt-cured pork belly with thin streaks of meat running through layers of fat, cheaper than bacon, but serving similar purposes in sharecropper kitchens. Country stores sold it by the slab, often on credit that kept families perpetually indebted to landowners who controlled local commerce. The meat was sliced thin and fried slowly until fat rendered and the lean parts crisped, providing both a small portion of protein and precious cooking grease. Families ate streaky alongside biscuits and gravy for breakfast, or used it to season pots of beans and greens that simmered all day while everyone worked fields. The salty, smoky flavor permeated everything it touched, making bland vegetables taste rich and satisfying. Children learned early that this wasn't meat to fill you up. It was meat to flavor everything else, stretching pennies into meals. Streaky represented the constant calculation of poverty cooking, where every ingredient served multiple purposes. Fried corn was fresh kernels cut from the cob and cooked in bacon drippings until tender and slightly caramelized, a summer dish that captured the season's sweetness. Sharecropper families grew corn in small patches when landlords allowed garden space, harvesting ears at peak ripeness when kernels still spurted milk when pierced. The corn was cut from cobs using sharp knives, then scraped to release the creamy liquid inside each kernel. Dropped into hot cast iron with bacon fat, the corn sizzled and sweetened, developing golden spots while staying tender inside. Some cooks added onions or peppers, others kept it pure to let corn's natural sugar shine through the smoky richness of the drippings. This dish appeared at summer suppers, served alongside fresh tomatoes and cornbread, celebrating the brief abundance before canning season began. Children shucked corn on porches while adults cut and scraped, the whole family working together to preserve summer's gift. Fried corn was happiness in a skillet. Sorghum syrup was liquid gold pressed from tall cane stalks that sharecropper families grew and processed communally when harvest time came. The stalks were cut by hand, stripped of leaves, and fed through horse-powered mills that crushed them to extract green juice collected in large vats. This juice was boiled for hours in shallow pans over wood fires, requiring constant stirring and skimming as it transformed from thin liquid into thick amber syrup. The process was community work, neighbors helping neighbors in exchange for shares of the finished product. Sorghum was poured into jars and stored for year-round use, drizzled over biscuits, stirred into cornbread batter, or used as the only sweetener many families could afford. Its flavor was earthier than molasses, with hints of grass and caramel that defined Southern breakfasts for generations. Children gathered around cooking pans, hoping for sticky samples from the stirring paddle. Sorghum syrup was self-sufficiency made edible, sweetness earned through labor. Hoppin John was rice, simmered with black-eyed peas and pork, a dish carrying African spiritual symbolism and Southern practicality in every spoonful. The recipe had roots in Senegalese and Gullah food traditions where rice and beans were dietary staples long before enslavement brought those traditions to American soil. Sharecroppers adapted these ancestral dishes using ingredients available on plantations: black-eyed peas grown in gardens, rice from coastal regions, and pork scraps from kitchens. The dish was eaten on New Year's Day for good luck, with peas symbolizing coins and greens served alongside representing paper money. But it wasn't just holiday food, it was everyday ingenuity. Rice and peas stretched to feed large families, and pork added richness to keep spirits high even when pockets were empty. Seasonings varied by region, but almost always included onion, garlic, and bay leaf. Leftovers were never discarded, but reincarnated the next day, frugality celebrated as virtue. Crackling cornbread elevated ordinary bread by folding in crispy bits of rendered pork skin, creating a dish that was both sustenance and celebration. During fall hog killing season, families rendered lard from fat trimmings, and the crispy remnants left behind, cracklings, became prized ingredients saved for special occasions. The cornbread batter was simple: cornmeal, buttermilk, eggs, salt, and leavening. But when handfuls of cracklings were stirred in, the bread transformed into something extraordinary. Baked in scorching hot cast iron, the bread developed a crunchy bottom, while cracklings distributed throughout added salty bursts of pork in every bite. This wasn't poverty food in taste, it was poverty food in origin, proving that scraps could become treasure. Families served crackling cornbread at Sunday dinners, holiday tables, and any occasion deserving something special. The crackling sound of biting through pork-studded crust was the sound of resilience rewarding itself. Poke salad, sometimes spelled poke, was wild greens gathered from ditches, fence lines, and forest edges where pokeweed grew abundantly every spring. The plant was dangerous if improperly prepared, its mature leaves and berries containing toxins that could sicken or kill. But sharecropper families knew the secrets passed down through generations. Pick only young shoots, boil them in 3 changes of water, then fry them in pork grease until tender. The result was surprisingly mild and earthy, not unlike spinach, but with distinct character. For families without money for store vegetables or enough garden space, poke salad meant free nutrition, requiring only knowledge and effort to harvest safely. Children accompany adults on gathering trips, learning to identify the right plants at the right stage, understanding that this skill might someday mean the difference between hunger and health. The tradition connected sharecroppers to the land in ways that transcended their economic bondage, finding freedom in foraging. Red gravy with rice was a simple but sustaining dish that turned tomatoes and pan drippings into sauce poured over steaming mounds of rice. Sharecropper families made it from fresh tomatoes in summer or canned tomatoes through winter, cooking them down with onions and leftover bacon or fatback grease. The mixture simmered until tomatoes broke down into thick, rich gravy, seasoned with salt, pepper, and whatever herbs grew near the cabin. Rice was cheap. Coastal plantations had grown it for centuries, and it stretched to feed families when meat was scarce. The combination provided carbohydrates for energy, vitamins from tomatoes, and fat for satiation, all in one economical dish. Children often ate it for breakfast before school, the tangy sweetness of tomatoes waking up morning appetites. Some families added okra or peppers, others kept it simple, but all recognized red gravy as essential survival food. This dish proved that satisfying meals didn't require expensive ingredients or complex preparation. Cornmeal mush was hot porridge made from nothing more than cornmeal, water, and salt, yet it sustained countless sharecropper families through hungry mornings. The preparation was simple but required attention. Cornmeal was whisked slowly into boiling water to prevent lumps, then stirred constantly as it thickened into creamy porridge. Some families added milk when their cow was producing. Others made do with water alone. Served hot with a drizzle of molasses or sorghum syrup, the mush provided quick energy for field work ahead. Any leftovers were poured into pans and chilled until solid, then sliced and fried the next morning in bacon grease until crispy on the outside. This transformation from soft porridge to crunchy fried cakes represented the no-waste philosophy that defined sharecropper cooking. Children grew up eating mush both ways, never questioning its constancy on their tables. Cornmeal mush was survival in its purest form, requiring only the cheapest ingredients and patience to create. Milk gravy was a simple sauce that stretched precious dairy into nourishment for entire families, poured over biscuits when nothing else was available. Sharecropper women made it by heating milk with flour, whisked smooth to prevent lumps, stirring constantly over wood fires until the mixture thickened. Salt and pepper were the only seasonings needed, though some added butter when available. The result was white, creamy gravy, transforming plain biscuits into something filling. Unlike sawmill gravy made from meat drippings, milk gravy used only dairy, making it the option when no meat had been cooked. It appeared at breakfast tables across the rural South, feeding children before school and adults before fieldwork began. The gravy was economical in the extreme, using milk from family cows and flour from pantries, requiring nothing purchased on credit. This dish represented making do with the minimum, finding sustenance where others might see nothing. Fried pies were hand-sized turnovers filled with whatever fruit was in season, then fried in lard until golden, portable sweetness that field workers carried in pockets. Sharecropper families made dried apple or peach filling from fruit preserved during summer, stewing it with sugar or molasses until thick. Biscuit dough was rolled thin, cut into rounds, filled with fruit mixture, and folded into half moons with edges crimped tight using fork tines. The pies were fried in cast iron filled with hot lard, turning once until both sides achieved a deep golden brown. The crust was flaky and slightly crisp, the filling hot and sweet inside. These weren't bakery pastries, they were survival sweets made when fruit was plenty. Mothers made batches lasting several days, packing them in lunch pails and coat pockets for workers needing energy between meals. Fried pies represented celebration despite poverty, proving love could be wrapped in dough. Squirrel stew was protein hunted from trees rather than purchased from stores, providing meat for families whose poverty made store-bought cuts impossible dreams. Sharecropper men and boys hunted squirrels year-round, using small caliber rifles or homemade traps to bring home game that multiplied across every hollow and ridge. The squirrels were skinned, cleaned, and cut into pieces, then browned in cast iron before being covered with water and whatever vegetables were available: onions, potatoes, carrots, wild greens. The stew simmered for hours until meat fell from bones and broth turned rich and flavorful. One pot could stretch across several meals, served with cornbread for soaking up every drop. Children grew up eating squirrel without thinking it strange, understanding that wild game meant food their families controlled rather than food requiring landowner credit. The hunting itself provided brief freedom, time in woods, away from cotton fields, following ancestral skills that predated their bondage. Persimmon pudding was autumn's gift transformed into dense, spiced sweetness that appeared when wild trees dropped ripe fruit across the rural South. The trick was waiting. Persimmons picked before frost remained mouth-puckeringly astringent, but once cold nights worked their magic, the fruit turned impossibly sweet. Sharecropper families gathered them from wild trees growing along fence rows and forest edges, processing the soft pulp through colanders to remove seeds and skins. The pulp was mixed with flour, eggs, milk, sugar or molasses, and spices like cinnamon and nutmeg, then baked slowly until set like dense custard. The color was deep orange-brown, the texture somewhere between pudding and cake, the flavor unlike anything else, sweet, spicy, and complex. This wasn't purchased dessert, it was foraged, requiring only knowledge of where trees grew and patience to wait for proper ripening. Persimmon pudding represented the gifts, wild places offered to those who knew how to receive them. Pinto beans, and cornbread was the foundation meal, the combination families could depend on when everything else failed and pantries held nothing but staples. Dried beans were soaked overnight, then simmered all day with ham hocks, fatback, or sometimes just salt, the hours of cooking transforming them from hard pellets into creamy, comforting sustenance. The cornbread was mixed quickly from cornmeal, buttermilk, salt, and a bit of leavening, baked in preheated cast iron until golden and crisp bottomed. Together, beans and bread created complete protein, the amino acids combining to provide nutrition rivaling expensive meat at a fraction of the cost. This meal appeared on sharecropper tables weekly, sometimes daily, providing the baseline of survival that families could count on. Children grew up knowing its taste as well as they knew their own names, the flavor of security in insecure times. This combination kept generations alive, proving that humble ingredients properly prepared could sustain both body and spirit. Stewed tomatoes with bread was a dish so simple it seemed impossible to call a meal, yet it filled bellies and provided vitamins when little else was available. Fresh tomatoes in summer or home-canned ones through winter were simmered with sugar, butter, salt, and often bits of stale bread torn directly into the pot. As the mixture cooked, bread absorbed tomato juices and softened into something between soup and stew, sweet and savory in equal measure. Some families added onions or bacon drippings for extra flavor, while others kept it pure, just tomatoes and bread, stretching resources as far as possible. This dish appeared when money ran out between settlements, when credit at the store was denied, when hunger pressed harder than pride. Children ate it without complaint, understanding that this was what survival sometimes looked like. Stewed tomatoes represented the ultimate economy of sharecropper cooking, requiring almost nothing yet providing something warm and filling. The dish carried no shame, only necessity. Possum and sweet potatoes was special occasion food, combining hunted game with garden-grown roots into a dish that graced Sunday tables when families wanted something beyond ordinary. Possums were caught in traps or hunted at night, their meat requiring careful preparation to remove gamey flavors. The animal was cleaned, parboiled to reduce wildness, then roasted slowly in Dutch ovens, surrounded by sweet potatoes that absorbed meat drippings as they cooked. The result was rich and slightly sweet, the potato flesh caramelizing against possum fat until tender and complex in flavor. This wasn't everyday food. Catching possums took time and luck, and the dish required hours of cooking that working days didn't allow. When it appeared, families gathered with anticipation, knowing this meal represented abundance in a life defined by scarcity. Children learned to appreciate wild game as delicacy rather than desperation, understanding that hunting skills provided dignity alongside sustenance. Greens and potlikker was the essential combination. Collards, turnips, or mustard greens, simmered until tender, served alongside the cooking liquid that contained concentrated nutrition. Sharecropper families grew greens in garden patches, valuing them for hardiness that survived summer heat and fall frosts alike. The greens were washed repeatedly to remove dirt and grit, then cooked for hours with ham hocks, fatback, or smoked meat that flavored the liquid as leaves softened. The potlikker, that precious green gold broth, was never thrown away but soaked up with cornbread or drunk straight from cups. This combination provided iron, vitamins, and protein in forms bodies could easily absorb, fighting the malnutrition that poverty inflicted. Mothers served greens to sick children, pregnant women, and anyone needing strength, trusting ancestral wisdom that this food healed. The dish connected sharecroppers to African traditions where greens held central dietary importance, maintaining cultural identity through cookpots. Blackberry cobbler was summer's reward for scratched arms and stained fingers made from wild berries growing along every fence row and roadside in the rural South. Children were sent out with buckets to gather berries, returning with purple-stained mouths that testified to quality control testing along the way. The berries were sweetened with sugar or molasses, thickened slightly with flour, and poured into baking dishes before being topped with biscuit dough or simple batter. As the cobbler baked, fruit bubbled up through the crust, creating valleys of purple sweetness surrounded by golden peaks of bread. The smell announced dessert throughout small cabins, drawing families to tables with anticipation. This wasn't purchased sweetness, it was foraged, free for the taking by those willing to work for it. Blackberry cobbler appeared at church suppers, family gatherings, and any summer Sunday when berries were ripe and wood stoves were hot. The dish proved that abundance existed even in poverty. Hog's head cheese wasn't cheese at all, but rather a jelly loaf made from boiled hog head meat, a tradition that ensured nothing from fall butchering went to waste. The head was cleaned thoroughly, then simmered for hours until meat fell from bones and the broth turned gelatinous from rendered collagen. The tender meat was picked from the head, cheeks, snout, tongue, and bits from every crevice, then chopped and seasoned with salt, pepper, sage, and vinegar. This mixture was packed into molds or pans and chilled until the natural gelatin set it firm enough to slice. The result was a savory, tangy loaf that could be eaten cold on crackers or bread, sliced for sandwiches, or served as part of holiday spreads. Hog's head cheese represented the ultimate no-waste philosophy, transforming a part most would discard into a delicacy that lasted for weeks. Children learned that every piece of the animal had purpose, that respect for food meant using all of what you had.
Wild berry syrup on biscuits was a dish that connected people to the land around them. Families foraged for blackberries, muscadines, or other wild berries when money for store-bought sugar was scarce. The berries were boiled down into thick syrups, which were then poured generously over biscuits hot from the oven. This simple act turned foraging into a memory of sweetness, tying hard times to small joys. Children especially looked forward to berry syrup, savoring the rare taste of fruit in seasons when fresh produce was otherwise out of reach. Adults valued it as a resourceful way of providing variety without spending money. Wild berry syrup on biscuits carried with it the taste of summer, the memory of hands stained purple from picking, and the resilience of communities who found sweetness in the fields and woods. It was survival made delicious, a reminder that even in scarcity, families could still find ways to savor life's small pleasures. Rice and raisin breakfast bowl turned leftover rice into a cozy, lightly sweet start to the day, perfect for stretching ingredients while feeding the family well. Cold rice was warmed in a saucepan with fresh milk, a spoonful of sugar, and a pinch of salt until creamy and fragrant. Plump raisins were stirred in, releasing their sweetness as they swelled in the heat. Some cooks added a dash of cinnamon or nutmeg for extra comfort, while others drizzled a bit of honey just before serving. This simple dish recalled generations of frugal but flavorful cooking, proving that nothing needed to be wasted to create a hearty meal. African American families valued its efficiency and warmth, often serving it with buttered toast or fruit on the side. Rice and raisin breakfast bowl demonstrated how the ingenuity of home cooks could transform plain leftovers into something soothing and delicious, a bowl that nourished both body and spirit during busy mornings or quiet weekend breakfasts alike. Coffee milk for kids was one of those small morning rituals that made children feel grown, even though the drink was mostly warm milk with only a tiny splash of coffee. Parents and grandparents mixed it carefully, Just enough coffee to tint the milk a light tan and add the faintest whisper of that roasted smell adults relied on to start their day. It was soothing, warm, and familiar. The kind of drink that made sleepy children perk up before school without giving them the full strength of adult coffee. Many African American households use this as a way to include children in the morning rhythm, letting them feel part of the adult world while still keeping things gentle. The taste was mild and slightly sweet, especially when a bit of sugar was added, and it had a comforting creaminess that stuck with you long after the cup was empty. The mornings felt quieter back then, slower, filled with the soft sounds of spoons stirring and radios humming low in the background. Coffee milk was not just a drink, it was a moment, a shared start to the day that made you feel loved and included. Even now, the memory of that warm cup brings people back to kitchens filled with steam, conversation, and the steady comfort of family. Salmon croquettes with grits turned pantry staples into a breakfast feast that felt both luxurious and familiar across African American communities of the 1970s. Canned salmon was flaked into a bowl with onions, breadcrumbs, and a little seasoning, then shaped into neat patties ready for the skillet. As they fried, the croquettes developed a crisp golden crust while staying moist inside, their aroma mingling with the gentle steam of creamy stone-ground grits bubbling nearby. This pairing brought together the coastal traditions of the South and the practicality of modern kitchens, where canned fish kept well and stretched to feed a family. Some cooks added a squeeze of lemon or a pinch of cayenne for extra brightness and heat, while others folded in fresh herbs from backyard gardens. Served with a side of sliced tomatoes or greens, salmon croquettes with grits delivered protein, comfort, and a taste of heritage, showing how everyday ingredients could be elevated into a soulful breakfast worth savoring. Eggless mayonnaise biscuits were one of those recipes that came out of necessity, but lingered in kitchens long after shortages eased. Families discovered that a spoonful of mayonnaise could stand in for eggs and fat, binding dough into soft, fluffy biscuits without using precious rationed ingredients. During the Civil Rights era, this recipe stuck around because it was practical and affordable, perfect for households where money and supplies were always stretched thin. Mothers could bake a tray in the morning, serving them plain, with syrup, or alongside whatever small scraps were available. Children often carried leftovers in their pockets to school, eating them between lessons for a bit of comfort and energy. The taste was familiar and reliable, even if the origins came from harder times. Eggless mayonnaise biscuits symbolized more than just thrift. They carried the determination to keep families fed through resourcefulness. They became a quiet staple on breakfast tables that fueled long days of work, activism, and resilience. Peach cobbler oatmeal captured the sweet essence of a beloved dessert while remaining wholesome enough for breakfast. Rolled oats simmered slowly in milk until creamy, then were topped with juicy peaches cooked down with a little brown sugar and a hint of cinnamon. The warm fruit formed a syrupy topping that soaked into the oats, creating a bowl that tasted indulgent but felt nourishing. Some families added a dollop of butter or a drizzle of honey for extra richness, while others sprinkled crushed pecans for a pleasant crunch. This dish mirrored the flavors of a classic peach cobbler while staying simple and hearty, making it a favorite in African American households seeking both comfort and health. Peach cobbler oatmeal proved that morning meals could echo the desserts of family gatherings, carrying the warmth of summer peaches and the memory of sweet celebrations into every spoonful, turning an everyday breakfast into something gently festive and deeply satisfying without excess effort. Egg and rice bowls were one of those fast, dependable breakfasts grandparents made without thinking, because the ingredients were always there and the result was always good. A pot of rice from last night could be rewarmed with a pat of butter, turning it soft and fragrant again. Then came the egg, fried or scrambled, laid gently over the top like a finishing touch. Only older hands knew how to time perfectly. The yolk soaked into the rice or the scrambled bits mixed through, creating a bowl that tasted warm, mild, and deeply comforting. It was cheap, quick, and endlessly reliable, the kind of breakfast that made mornings feel steady. Families loved it because nothing went to waste, because rice could stretch farther than any box of cereal ever could. Egg and rice bowls tasted like routine, like care, like the kind of quiet morning love that came before the sun was fully up.
Which forgotten sharecropper food do you remember from your family's table?